Do you often find yourself getting overwhelmed by anxious thoughts where the anxiety keeps getting worse and worse? And one anxious thought leads to another anxious thought, and you start to feel increasingly panicky. And no matter what you do, you can't seem to stop that spiraling. If that sounds like you, then stick around because I have a technique that is going to help you stop spiraling in just 3 minutes. I am Heather. I'm an anxiety coach. I personally overcame high functioning anxiety and have had the opportunity to work with hundreds of clients to help them heal their anxiety so that they can finally feel better and start living the life that they want to live. So first, I want to briefly define spiraling, just so you and I are on the same page. We know that we're talking about the same thing. Anxiety is a totally normal response to a stressor or a perceived danger. And anxiety triggers your nervous system into a fight, flight, or freeze response. And while that is happening, your body is releasing stress hormones to respond to that perceived threat, to that perceived danger. And when there's hormones are releasing into your body, that usually means that you're going to start to have some accompanying body symptoms, some reactions to the stress hormones. That could be sweating, that could be a racing heart. There's a whole bunch of things that may happen to you in particular, unique to you. And when you're spiraling, you're going to start to think of even more reasons to fear that perceived danger, which is going to continue to release those stress hormones. And then most likely you're going to start to become very fearful of those body reactions, those body symptoms that you're having. And then your mind will start to think that something very serious is happening to your body, like you're having a heart attack. Basically, your mind starts to feed off of itself and you become increasingly panicked, which is spiraling. And once you start spiraling, it can be really hard to stop. And that's why I wanted to give you this technique. If you start using it anytime you're spiraling, you're going to get better and better at the technique, and you'll be able to stop spiraling quicker. Once you learn this technique, you should be able to do it in under 3 minutes once you get the hang of it. And please listen to the full technique because there is a mistake that I have seen people make when they are using this technique. I want to tell you about that to make sure that you don't make the same mistake that I've seen. So that stressor, that perceived danger that I mentioned, when you're spiraling, you have to become aware of what you think that stressor or that perceived danger is. That's the first step. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call this hypothetical perceived danger, the stressor. I'm going to call it bad thing number one. Then the next step is to think, well, if bad thing number one happens, what is the next thing that I'm worried about that I think is going to happen next? And so for that next bad thing, we're going to call that bad thing number two. And if bad thing number two happens, then you have to think, well, what is the next thing that I'm worried will happen? And so that bad thing, that next bad thing, we're going to call bad thing number three. So do you see where I am going with this? This is a process that I call the worst case scenario, which is known as catastrophizing in psychological terms. And when you are spiraling, your mind just keeps spinning. You keep thinking of increasingly negative thoughts, which continue to release those stress hormones. But this is what I have seen happen for so many people. They become so afraid of thinking of the next bad thing because it's really scary. And so what will happen is they'll get maybe one or two or three down to, bad thing number three, and they just start to try and push it out of their mind because it is just too scary. It's freaking them out. They just want to stop thinking about it. But what happens is that doesn't really work. So what happens in your mind is that you wind up sort of staying stuck in that stress response because your mind is stuck on that bad thing, even if you're not maybe actively thinking about it and you try to, push it away so you weren't thinking about it, part of your mind is still stuck there in that stress response. So what you need to do in the technique is what I call get all the way to the bottom. And what I mean by that is thinking of this like final bad thing, this ultimate bad thing, that if you go down the sequence, you get all the way to the bottom of what could be the possible worst outcome of this perceived threat, the stressor that you're experiencing. And this, I think, is going to be a huge help to you. I'm going to give you a real life example from a client that I worked with. Before I do that, I would love for you to drop a comment below for me and for others who are watching the video about a concern, a perceived danger, a stressor that you have had at some point, maybe recently, that wound up making you spiral. And when you view each other's comments, this is really helpful for everyone because you're going to realize you're not alone in your struggle with anxiety. So I appreciate you dropping a comment, and others who are watching the video will as well. So back to my client. When the pandemic hit, I am making this video right now in September 2021. So way over a year ago, when the pandemic hit, my client was very worried that her company that she worked at was not going to be making as much money as they normally did, right? Pretty logical thought. A lot of companies and businesses were struggling. And so she was really concerned that the company was going to wind up laying off employees and that she was going to lose her job. So that, in this example, is bad thing number one. I'm going to get laid off. And then when I asked her, well, what do you think is going to happen next? She said, well, my husband and I won't be able to pay our mortgage and we're going to have to sell our house. And this is actually the mistake that I was referring to. And I see this happen a lot in the exercise, is that people will jump over the next bad thing. They'll basically skip in the sequence. They'll sort of jump down from, let's say, bad thing number one to bad thing number four. They're just skipping one or more bad things. To fully understand where your mind is going when you're spiraling, it's important for you. I think it's really important for you to understand each sequential step that is taking place in your mind about the perceived danger. So for my client, I asked her if she would really have to immediately sell her house if she got laid off. And she said, well, no, I have money in savings. I have a 401k that I could cash out and I could use that to pay for the mortgage for a while. And so that is actually bad thing number two. I'm going to have to use my savings to pay for my mortgage. And I kept asking her, well, what would happen next? And then she said, well, after we deplete our savings, then we'd have to sell our house. And then we would probably move in with my sister. I think that she would take us in. So you can see that is a next bad thing, move in with my sister. And then my client said, but she would probably only let us stay in her house for so long. So then we'd have to leave her house and then we'd be homeless. And so that is all the way to the bottom. That is the ultimate bad thing in this scenario for my client. In this worst case scenario, she was thinking, I'm going to lose my job, and then eventually that will lead me to be homeless. And my client had never let her mind go that far, which is what I said people do. They will tend to stop at bad thing number two or bad thing number three because it's so scary and it just makes them so incredibly anxious. So for her, she got all the way down to the bottom and realized that the ultimate bad thing, the worst thing in this worst case scenario, is that she would be homeless. And then when she saw that and realized that, she thought, hey, wait a minute, the likelihood of that happening is virtually impossible. She and her husband are very skilled. They have been in the workforce for a long time. They're highly employable. And she realized that the likelihood of them not having a job, not being able to get another job, and then wind up being homeless, that was extremely unlikely. So when she let her mind go down all the way to the bottom, she stopped spiraling and she started to feel a lot better very quickly because she realized that her worst fear was extremely unlikely. So next time you are spiraling, I want you to try this technique that I just told you about. It would probably be helpful for you to actually write it down on paper, where you put the first bad thing and then you draw an arrow down and then you write the next bad thing with an arrow down, so that you're moving down the paper vertically. And when you're writing them down, that actually will also be helpful, because then you can make sure that you're not skipping any of the bad things in the sequence. And just having the visual also with the very bad thing, the ultimate bad thing down at the bottom, is useful for you to see it that way as well. And the more you practice this technique, as I said at the very beginning, the faster that you're going to get. You should be able to do this in under 3 minutes every time, probably less, the more you practice it. And the benefit of all of this, of course, is that you're going to stop spiraling when you do this technique. So if you're ready to start addressing your anxiety, to finally heal the root cause of why you spiral, of why you have anxiety, I work with individuals in one-on-one coaching, and I also offer group programs. So I will link in the description below, so you can go and find more information about that. And I'm also going to pin a comment with another video about anxiety that I think you're going to find really helpful. So go and watch that one next. And thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next time.